I remember the exact moment the sea decided to swallow us whole, and I remember thinking, as the black water closed over my head, that at least in death I would finally be free of him. How strange it is that the very catastrophe I believed would end my suffering became the beginning of everything I never dared to dream. My name is Rosalind, and for 7 years I served in the household of Lord Adrian Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth, a man whose coldness could freeze the summer air and whose gaze could wither the strongest spirit. I was nothing to him, less than nothing, a shadow that moved through his grand estate, carrying linens and polishing silver, a creature so far beneath his notice that in all those years he never once spoke my name. I was simply the maid, one of many, indistinguishable from the wallpaper, and just as easily replaced. The voyage had been his idea, a business matter requiring his presence in the southern colonies, and I had been assigned to accompany the household staff traveling with him. It was considered an honor by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, who told me I should be grateful for the opportunity to serve His Grace abroad. I felt no gratitude, only the familiar weight of duty pressing down upon my shoulders like the yoke upon an ox. I packed my small trunk with my 2 spare uniforms and my mother's rosary, the only possession I treasured, and I boarded the ship called the Arabella with the resignation of one who has long since stopped expecting anything from life but labor and silence. The Duke occupied the finest cabin, naturally, while we servants were crammed into the lower quarters, where the smell of brine and tar mixed with the sweat of too many bodies in too small a space. I rarely saw him during those first weeks at sea, and when I did, it was only in passing, his tall figure sweeping through the corridors with that characteristic coldness, his dark eyes looking through me as though I were made of glass. He was handsome in the way that marble statues are handsome, all sharp angles and perfect proportions, utterly devoid of warmth. I had heard the whispers about him, of course, the tragic story of his young wife who had died in childbirth along with the babe, leaving him a widower at 23. That had been 8 years ago, and in all that time he had never remarried, never softened, never shown a single crack in his impenetrable armor. The storm came upon us in the night, without warning, as if the heavens themselves had decided to punish our presumption in daring to cross their domain. I was in my narrow bunk when the first great wave struck the ship, throwing me from my bed onto the hard wooden floor. The screaming began almost immediately, the terrible chorus of fear and confusion that rises when human beings realize they are at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. I stumbled through the darkness, trying to find my way to the deck, the ship pitching so violently that I could barely keep my feet. What I saw when I finally emerged into the open air still haunts my dreams. The sky was a churning mass of black clouds split by lightning, and the waves rose around us like mountains of angry water, their crests white with foam. The crew was fighting desperately to save the ship, but even my untrained eye could see that it was hopeless. The mainmast had already cracked, hanging at a terrible angle, and water was pouring into the hold faster than it could be pumped out. I do not know how long the chaos lasted. Time loses all meaning in such moments. I remember being thrown against the railing, remember the cold shock of water washing over me, remember hands grabbing at me, and then letting go. And then I was in the sea itself, the black water closing over my head, the salt burning my eyes and my lungs, and I thought with strange calm that this was how it ended. This was how Rosalind the maid would leave this world, unnamed and unmourned, swallowed by the indifferent ocean. But the sea, it seemed, was not finished with me yet. I woke on sand, my cheek pressed against something gritty and wet, my body aching in places I did not know could ache. The sun was brutal above me, a white disk in a cloudless sky, and for a long moment I simply lay there, too exhausted to move, trying to understand how I had come to be alive when I had been so certain I was dead. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, coughing up seawater, my hair hanging around my face in salt-stiffened tangles. The beach stretched before me, a crescent of pale sand bordered by rocks on one side and dense vegetation on the other. Debris from the ship littered the shoreline, broken planks and torn canvas and objects I could not identify. And there, perhaps 20 yards from where I knelt, lay a figure in sodden clothing, motionless on the sand. Even before I reached him, I knew who it was. There was something unmistakable about that tall frame, those broad shoulders, that dark hair now plastered wetly to his skull. The Duke of Ashworth lay on his back with his eyes closed, and for one terrible moment I thought he was dead. I knelt beside him, my hand hovering over his chest, unsure whether to touch him, unsure whether I was even permitted to touch him, and then his eyes flew open and he gasped for air like a man who has been holding his breath for an eternity. His gaze found mine, and I saw confusion there, and something that might have been fear. Emotions I had never before witnessed on that cold, aristocratic face. He stared at me as though he did not recognize me, as though I were some creature from a dream or a nightmare, and then comprehension dawned, and his expression hardened into something more familiar. "You," he said, his voice hoarse from salt water. "The maid." "Yes, Your Grace," I replied, falling automatically into the pattern of deference that had been drilled into me since girlhood. "Are you injured?" He did not answer. Instead, he pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing, and looked around at the beach with mounting horror. I watched the realization wash over him, watched him understand that the ship was gone, that the crew was gone, that everything was gone except this strange island and the servant girl kneeling beside him in her ruined uniform. "Where are the others?" he demanded. "I do not know, Your Grace. I saw no one else when I woke." He was on his feet in an instant, scanning the shoreline, calling out names I did not recognize, officers and servants, and perhaps friends, though I could not imagine him having friends. No one answered. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the waves and the distant cry of seabirds. We were alone. The first day passed in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. The Duke organized our situation with military precision, or at least he attempted to, but there was little to organize. We gathered what useful debris we could find from the wreckage, a few crates of supplies, some rope, a tattered sail that might serve as shelter. I followed his orders without question, hauling things across the sand, my muscles screaming in protest, my mind carefully blank. This was what I knew, after all. This was what I had always done. He commanded, and I obeyed. And the fact that our circumstances had changed so dramatically did not alter the fundamental nature of our relationship. Or so I believed. It was on the second day that everything shifted, that the world as I understood it cracked open like an egg, and something new and terrifying emerged. We had managed to catch a fish, or rather, the Duke had managed to catch a fish, using a makeshift line fashioned from string found among the debris and a hook bent from a bit of wire. He had struggled with it for hours, cursing under his breath in a most undignified manner, and when he finally pulled the creature from the water, he held it aloft with an expression of triumph that seemed almost boyish. It was the first time I had ever seen him look anything other than cold. "Build a fire," he ordered, thrusting the fish toward me, "and cook this." I stared at the fish in my hands, its scales glinting silver in the sunlight, its dead eye gazing up at me with what seemed like accusation. My stomach cramped painfully. We had not eaten anything but a few biscuits salvaged from the wreckage, and those had run out the night before. I was so hungry that my hands shook, so hungry that I could barely think of anything else. "Did you hear me?" the Duke snapped. "Cook the fish. I am hungry." I looked at him then, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in all the years I had served in his household. I saw the arrogance in the set of his jaw, the expectation in his eyes, the absolute certainty that his word was law and that I would obey as I had always obeyed. And something inside me, something that had been sleeping for so long I had forgotten it existed, suddenly woke up. I do not know where the courage came from. Perhaps it was the hunger, stripping away the careful layers of submission I had built around myself over the years. Perhaps it was the strangeness of our situation, so far removed from the rules and hierarchies that had governed my entire life. Perhaps I had simply reached the end of something, a thread that had been fraying for years finally snapping. I raised the fish to my lips and I bit into it, raw, the flesh cold and slippery against my tongue. I chewed and I swallowed, and then I took another bite, and another, while the Duke watched with an expression of such profound shock that it might have been comical under different circumstances. "What are you doing?" he sputtered. "That is my fish. I caught it. It is mine." I swallowed the last bite and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. I looked him directly in the eye, something I had never dared to do before, and I spoke a single word. No. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It seemed to stretch between us like a living thing, thick and dangerous, charged with something I could not name. The Duke's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from shock to disbelief to outrage, his pale cheeks flushing with color, his dark eyes blazing. "No?" he repeated, as though he had never heard the word before. "No? You dare to say no to me?" "Yes," I said, and my voice did not tremble, which surprised me. "I dare." "Do you have any idea who I am?" "You are the Duke of Ashworth. I know perfectly well who you are." "Then you know that your insolence will not be tolerated. When we are rescued, you will be dismissed without a reference. You will never work in service again. I will see to it personally." I should have been terrified. That threat, delivered in another time and place, would have reduced me to tears and apologies. My entire livelihood depended on my position, on the references I might earn from employers satisfied with my work. Without them, I would be nothing, less than nothing, a woman alone in a world that had no place for women without means or connections. But something had changed. Something had shifted in the moment I bit into that fish, in the moment I said that forbidden word. I felt it in my bones, a strange new strength, a clarity I had never known before. We were not in his grand estate anymore. We were not surrounded by footmen and butlers and the elaborate machinery of aristocratic life. We were on a deserted island with nothing but sand and sky and the endless sea, and here, in this place, his title meant nothing. His wealth meant nothing. His power meant nothing at all. "If we are rescued," I said quietly, "and until then, Your Grace, you are welcome to catch your own fish and cook your own meals. I am no longer your servant." I turned and walked away from him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I expected him to follow, to grab me, to strike me perhaps, as I had seen other masters strike their servants when they overstepped. But he did nothing. He simply stood there on the beach, watching me go. And when I finally dared to look back, his face wore an expression I had never seen before, something that might have been confusion or wonder or the first stirrings of something I could not yet name. That night, I slept beneath the makeshift shelter we had constructed from the sail, and I dreamed of my mother. She had been a servant too, as her mother had been before her, and her mother before that, generations of women who had bowed their heads and said yes and never questioned the order of things. She had died when I was 16, worn out by work and worry, and her last words to me had been a warning. "Do not hope for more, Rosalind," she had whispered, her hand cold in mine. "Hope is a luxury we cannot afford." But lying there on that island, listening to the waves and the wind and the strange calls of unfamiliar birds, I wondered for the first time if she had been wrong. The days that followed were unlike anything I could have imagined. The Duke, for all his arrogance, was not a fool. He quickly realized that without my cooperation, his chances of survival were significantly diminished. I had skills he lacked, practical skills learned from a lifetime of hard work. I knew how to build a fire that would actually stay lit. I knew how to find fresh water by following the flight patterns of birds. I knew how to fashion tools from whatever materials were at hand, knowledge passed down from my father, who had been a carpenter before drink and despair claimed him. At first, the Duke tried to maintain the old hierarchy. He issued orders and expected obedience, and when obedience was not forthcoming, he blustered and threatened and paced the beach like a caged animal. But I held firm. I would work alongside him, I said. I would share my knowledge and my labor. But I would not serve him, not anymore. "This is absurd," he said one evening, as we sat on opposite sides of the fire I had built, eating the crabs I had taught him to catch. "You are a servant, I am a duke. There is a natural order to things." "The natural order," I replied, "is that the strong survive and the weak perish. On this island, Your Grace, your title will not keep you warm or fill your belly. Perhaps it is time to learn some new skills." He glared at me across the flames, but I thought I saw something else flickering in his eyes, something that might have been respect, or perhaps it was simply hunger. It was difficult to tell. "You are an impertinent woman," he said finally. "I am a practical woman," I corrected him. "There is a difference." Slowly, grudgingly, he began to change. It did not happen all at once, and there were many days of tension and frustration, of sharp words and sullen silences. But necessity is a powerful teacher, and the Duke of Ashworth proved to be a more apt pupil than I would have expected. He learned to catch fish without my help, to clean them and cook them without complaint. He learned to gather firewood and maintain the fire through the night. He learned to weave palm fronds into something resembling a roof for our shelter, though his first attempts were so pitiful that I could not help but laugh. That was the first time I laughed in his presence, and he looked at me as though I had sprouted a second head. "What amuses you?" he demanded, his cheeks flushing. "Your weaving, Your Grace. My grandmother could do better, and she has been dead for 15 years. I expected anger, but instead, something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth twitched just slightly, and then he laughed too. It was a rusty sound, as though he had not used it in a very long time, but it was genuine, and it transformed his face in ways I had never imagined possible. For just a moment, he looked almost human. "You are a cruel woman," he said, but there was no malice in it. "I am an honest woman," I replied. "Perhaps that is something new for you." He held my gaze for a long moment, and something passed between us, something I could not define. Then he turned back to his weaving, and the moment passed, but I felt its echo in my chest for a long time afterward. As the weeks went by, I began to see a different man emerging from behind the cold facade of the Duke of Ashworth. Or perhaps emerging is not the right word. Perhaps it is more accurate to say that I began to see a man who had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of pride and pain and the terrible weight of expectation. He told me about his wife one evening, as the sun set over the water in a blaze of orange and gold. I had not asked, would never have dared to ask, but the words seemed to spill from him of their own accord, as though they had been waiting years for release. "Her name was Catherine," he said, his voice soft in a way I had never heard before. "We were married when I was 22 and she was 19. An arrangement, of course. Our families had planned it since we were in the cradle. I did not love her when we wed, but I grew to love her. She was kind and gentle, and she saw something in me that others did not. She believed I could be more than the cold, dutiful heir my father had raised me to be." He paused, and I saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "She died bringing our son into the world. The babe died with her. I held him in my arms, this tiny, perfect creature, and I watched the life leave him before he had even drawn breath. And something in me died too that day, something I thought I would never get back. I did not know what to say. I had known loss, of course. I had lost my mother and my father and the future I might have had if I had been born into a different station. But I had never lost a wife and a child, had never felt the particular devastation of watching love turn to dust in my hands. "I am sorry," I said finally, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all I had. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Do you know," he said, "you are the first person in 8 years to say that to me without pity. Everyone else looks at me as though I am broken, as though I am something to be pitied and handled with care. But you just say it, simply and directly, like you mean it." "I do mean it." "Yes," he said slowly, "I believe you do." After that night, something changed between us. The hostility that had defined our early days on the island began to fade, replaced by something warmer, something tentative but real. We talked more, not just about practical matters, but about ourselves, our pasts, our hopes and fears. He told me about his childhood, about the father who had demanded perfection and the mother who had been too afraid of her husband to show her son affection. I told him about my mother, about the rosary she had given me that now lay somewhere at the bottom of the sea, about the dreams I had once harbored before life taught me that dreams were not for girls like me. "What dreams?" he asked one evening as we sat side by side watching the stars emerge over the dark water. I hesitated. I had never spoken of this to anyone, had buried it so deep that I had almost forgotten it myself. "I wanted to be a teacher," I said finally. "When I was a girl, before my mother became ill and I had to go into service, I used to read every book I could get my hands on. The vicar in our village let me borrow from his library. I would read by candlelight until my eyes ached, and I would imagine standing in front of a classroom, sharing what I had learned with others. But that was a long time ago. Such things are not possible for women like me." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Why not?" "Why not?" I repeated, surprised by the question. "Because I am a servant, because I have no money and no connections and no prospects, because the world is ordered in a certain way, and that order does not include former housemaids becoming teachers." "The world is ordered in a certain way," he echoed, and there was something bitter in his tone. "Yes, I know something about that. The world told me I must be cold and distant, that a duke does not show weakness, that grief must be hidden away like something shameful. The world told me that my wife's death was simply a tragedy to be borne, that I should remarry quickly and produce an heir, that feelings are a luxury men like me cannot afford." He turned to look at me, and in the starlight, his face seemed younger somehow, softer. "Perhaps the world is wrong, Rosalind. Perhaps the order we accept is not the only order possible." It was the first time he had ever spoken my name. I felt something stir in my chest, something dangerous and wonderful, something I had no right to feel. He was a duke, and I was a servant, and even here, on this island at the edge of the world, that gulf seemed impossibly wide. But when he looked at me like that, when he spoke my name in that quiet, wondering voice, the gulf seemed to shrink just a little. "Perhaps," I said softly, "perhaps it is." The weeks turned into months, and our little island became something like a home. We built a more permanent shelter, using techniques I remembered from my father and knowledge the Duke gleaned from books he had read long ago. We established routines, rising with the sun and working through the day, sharing meals and conversation by the fire each evening. We were comfortable with each other now, the awkwardness of those early days giving way to an easy familiarity that would have been unthinkable in our former life. I learned things about him that surprised me. He was a skilled artist, able to capture the beauty of our island in charcoal sketches made with burned sticks. He had a dry wit that emerged more frequently as the weeks passed, catching me off guard and making me laugh at unexpected moments. He was afraid of spiders, a fact I discovered one afternoon when he leaped back from a particularly large specimen with a yelp that was decidedly unducal. And he sang, sometimes, when he thought I could not hear, old ballads in a rich baritone that made something ache deep in my chest. He learned things about me too. He learned that I was stubborn and proud, that I did not suffer fools gladly, that I had a temper that flared hot and burned out quickly. He learned that I loved to swim, that I could hold my breath underwater for nearly 2 minutes, that the sea which had nearly killed me had become a source of joy. He learned that I hummed while I worked, the same melodies my mother had hummed before me, and that I talked in my sleep, though he was too much of a gentleman to tell me what I said. Gentleman. It was strange to think of him that way now. For so long he had been nothing more than a title to me, a cold figure in expensive clothes, an abstraction of power and privilege. But the man I had come to know on this island was neither cold nor abstract. He was real and flawed and surprisingly vulnerable, and I found myself thinking about him in ways that made my cheeks burn when I lay alone at night. It happened on an evening like any other, or perhaps not like any other at all. We had been gathering fruit from the trees at the island's center, and a sudden rainstorm had caught us far from the shelter. We ran through the downpour, laughing like children, and by the time we reached cover, we were both soaked to the skin. The fire had gone out, and the shelter was cold, and without thinking, I moved closer to him for warmth. He went very still. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, felt the heat of his body through our wet clothing, felt the moment stretch between us like a held breath. I should move away, I thought. I should apologize and retreat to my side of the shelter and pretend this never happened. That was what sense demanded. That was what propriety required. But I was so tired of sense and propriety. I was so tired of the rules that had governed my entire life, telling me what I could want and what I could not, telling me that love was something meant for other people, people born into better circumstances, people who deserved more than a servant's portion. "Rosalind," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that made my stomach flutter. "Yes?" He raised his hand and touched my face, his fingertips tracing the line of my cheek with a gentleness that undid me. "I have been trying very hard not to feel what I feel," he said quietly. "I have been telling myself that it is impossible, that it cannot be, that the world would never allow it. But here, on this island, the world seems very far away, and you seem very close." "What do you feel?" I whispered. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to mine, and the world fell away entirely. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question rather than a statement. But when I responded, when I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him closer, it deepened into something else. Something fierce and hungry and achingly tender all at once. I had been kissed before, once or twice, by boys in the village who had wanted things from me that I had not been willing to give. But those clumsy encounters had nothing in common with this. This was revelation. This was coming home to a place I had never known existed. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and shaking, he rested his forehead against mine and laughed softly. "Well," he said, "I did not expect that when I ordered you to cook my fish." I laughed too, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me. "Perhaps you should try giving orders more often. It seems to work out well for you eventually." "Impertinent woman," he murmured, but his eyes were warm, and when he kissed me again, I felt something new rising in my chest, something fragile and precious, something that might have been hope. We became lovers that night, and in the days that followed, our relationship transformed into something neither of us had words for. It was not the cold arrangement of aristocratic marriage, all duty and dynasty and carefully managed appearances. It was not the fleeting passion of an affair, born of opportunity and destined to fade. It was something altogether different, something that felt both ancient and brand new, as though we were the first people in the history of the world to discover that two hearts could beat as one. I knew it could not last. Some part of me, the practical part that had kept me alive through years of service and hardship, understood that this island was a dream from which we would eventually wake. Rescue would come someday, and when it did, we would return to a world that would never accept what we had found together. He was a duke and I was a servant, and not even love could bridge that divide. There were moments, though, when the divide seemed to disappear entirely. One afternoon, as we were exploring the far side of the island, we discovered a hidden cove, sheltered from the wind by towering cliffs and carpeted with sand so white it seemed to glow. A waterfall cascaded down from somewhere high above, filling a pool of crystal-clear water that sparkled in the dappled sunlight. "It is beautiful," I breathed, standing at the edge of the pool. "Yes," Adrian said, but when I turned to look at him, his eyes were not on the waterfall. They were on me. We swam together that day, shedding our ragged clothes and plunging into the cool water like the survivors of a different kind of shipwreck, one that had nothing to do with the sea. He caught me in his arms and spun me around, and I laughed with a joy I had not felt since childhood, a pure and uncomplicated happiness that asked nothing of the future, that existed wholly in the present moment. Later, we lay on the warm rocks beside the pool, letting the sun dry our skin, talking about nothing and everything. He told me about the books he had loved as a boy, adventure stories full of pirates and treasure and distant lands. I told him about the games I had played with my younger brother before the fever took him, games of imagination that had transported us far from our cramped cottage and our grinding poverty. We discovered that we had both dreamed of travel, of seeing the world beyond the narrow confines of our respective lives, and there was something bittersweet in realizing that it had taken a catastrophe to grant us both our wish. "I used to imagine I would sail to the Orient," Adrian said, his voice drowsy with warmth and contentment. "I would picture the temples and the palaces, the silks and the spices, the entire world so different from the gray English countryside. But my father forbade it. A duke does not go gallivanting about the globe," he said. "A duke has responsibilities." "And now here you are," I said, "on an island at the edge of nowhere, with nothing but a former servant for company." "Here I am," he agreed, "and I would not trade it for all the temples and palaces in the Orient." He reached out and took my hand, and we lay there in comfortable silence, watching the clouds drift across the endless blue sky. The rainy season came without warning, a deluge that lasted for weeks and tested our makeshift shelter to its limits. We huddled together by the fire, the rain drumming on the canvas above us, and I discovered that Adrian snored when he was tired and twitched in his sleep like a dreaming dog. I discovered that he was grumpy in the mornings until he had eaten something, and that he had a particular way of furrowing his brow when he was thinking hard about a problem, a way that made him look much younger than his years. "Stop staring at me," he muttered one morning, catching me watching him. "I am not staring. I am observing. There is a difference." "What are you observing, then?" "The way your eyebrow does that thing when you are concentrating. It is quite endearing." He reached out and tickled me, and I shrieked and squirmed away, and somehow we ended up tangled together in the blankets, breathless and laughing, the rain forgotten. These were the moments I treasured, the small intimacies that no one else would ever see or understand. In the great houses where I had served, I had glimpsed the marriages of the wealthy from the outside, the formal dinners and the separate bedrooms, the careful distance maintained even between husband and wife. I had assumed that was simply how the upper classes lived, that love and warmth and genuine connection were luxuries reserved for the poor who had nothing else to give each other. But Adrian was teaching me that I had been wrong about that too. Beneath the cold facade he had worn for so long, there was a man capable of deep and passionate feeling, a man who had simply been taught to hide that part of himself away. On this island, where there was no one to impress and no expectations to meet, he was free to be the person he had always been underneath, and that person was someone I could love without reservation. One evening, during a lull in the rains, He told me about the night his wife died. "I was not there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was in London, attending to business that seemed so important at the time." When the messenger arrived with the news, I rode through the night to reach her, but I was too late. She had been dead for hours by the time I arrived. He paused, swallowing hard. They had cleaned her up, dressed her in a white gown, arranged her on the bed like a sleeping princess, and beside her, in a tiny cradle, was my son. He looked so peaceful, so perfect. I kept waiting for him to cry, to move, to show some sign of life, but he never did. I held him as he wept, great racking sobs that shook his entire body. I did not try to comfort him with words, did not offer platitudes about time healing all wounds or the deceased being in a better place. I simply held him, letting him grieve, being present in his pain. "I blamed myself for years," he said finally, when the tears had subsided. "If I had been there, perhaps things would have been different. Perhaps I could have saved her somehow." "You could not have saved her," I said gently. "These things happen, and they are no one's fault." I know that now, but for a long time, the guilt was all I had. It was easier to feel guilty than to feel the loss. If I was guilty, then there was something I could have done, some action I could have taken to change the outcome. If I was not guilty, then she was simply gone, and there was nothing I could do but accept it. "And have you accepted it?" He looked at me, and his eyes were clear despite the tears. "I think I am beginning to," he said, "for the first time in 8 years. I think I am beginning to." The rains ended eventually, as rains always do, and the island emerged washed clean and brilliant, every leaf and flower seeming to glow with renewed vitality. We ventured out to survey our little domain, assessing the damage to our shelter and our supplies, and found that we had weathered the storm better than expected. The roof had held, more or less. The fire pit needed to be rebuilt. But we were alive, and we were together, and that was all that mattered. It was during one of these post-storm expeditions that I found the cave. I had been gathering driftwood on the western beach when I noticed a gap in the rocks, half hidden by vines and debris. Curiosity drew me closer, and I discovered that the gap opened into a cavern, cool and dark and surprisingly spacious. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I gasped. The walls were covered in paintings. They were old, impossibly old, images of people and animals rendered in faded pigments that must have been applied centuries ago. There were hunters with bows, women carrying children, strange beasts that looked like nothing I had ever seen. And above them all, dominating the back wall of the cave, was a great ship with billowing sails, surrounded by figures that might have been welcoming or might have been fleeing. I ran back to tell Adrian, and together we returned to the cave, torches in hand. He was as astonished as I had been, running his fingers reverently over the ancient images. "This island was inhabited once," he said, his voice hushed with wonder. "Long ago, before any European ship ever reached these waters, these people lived here, loved here, raised their families here. What happened to them? Who can say? Disease, perhaps, brought by the first explorers. Or they left of their own accord, seeking new shores. Or perhaps they simply died out, as all peoples do eventually." We stood there for a long time, contemplating the mysteries of the past. I thought about the generations of people who had called this island home, who had fished in its waters and slept beneath its stars, and never imagined that someday 2 strangers from a distant land would wash up on their shores. What would they have made of us, I wondered? What would they have thought of our strange clothes and our stranger customs, of the invisible barriers of class that we carried with us like a disease? "We are not so different from them," Adrian said, as if reading my thoughts. "All people, everywhere, throughout history, have faced the same fundamental challenges. How to find food, how to shelter from the elements, how to live together in some semblance of harmony. The details change, but the essence remains the same. And love, I said softly. All people, everywhere, have loved. He turned to look at me, and in the flickering torchlight, his face was solemn. Yes, he said, that most of all. But I pushed those thoughts away. I lived in the moment, in the warmth of his arms, and the sound of his laugh, and the way he looked at me as though I were something precious and rare. I had spent my whole life preparing for a future that never seemed to arrive. For once I decided I would simply be present in the now. It was Adrian who first saw the ship. We were walking along the beach, hand in hand, discussing nothing of importance and everything that mattered, when he suddenly stopped and pointed toward the horizon. A dark shape was moving there, too regular to be a cloud, too large to be a bird. "Rosalind," he said, and his voice was strange, caught somewhere between hope and dread. "Do you see that?" I saw it. My heart, which had been so light moments before, turned to stone in my chest. "A ship," I whispered. "Yes." We stood there in silence, watching the vessel grow larger on the horizon, and I felt the dream beginning to shatter around us. This was what we had hoped for in those early desperate days. This was salvation, rescue, return to the world we had left behind. I should have been overjoyed. Instead, I felt only a terrible, suffocating grief. "What happens now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Adrian did not respond immediately. He was still staring at the ship, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and determined. "We signal them," he said. "We let them rescue us, and then we face whatever comes together." "Together?" I repeated, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. He turned to me then, and his eyes were fierce with something I had never seen before, something that burned away all my doubts and fears. "Did you think I would abandon you?" he asked. "Did you think I would return to England and pretend that none of this ever happened? That you never happened?" "I am a servant," I said, the old reflexive shame rising in my throat. "You are a duke. The world will never accept." "Damn the world," he said, and the vehemence of it shocked me into silence. "Damn society and its rules and its endless petty judgments. I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, Rosalind. I married the woman I was told to marry. I behaved as I was told to behave. I buried my heart so deep I thought I would never find it again. And where did it get me? Alone and cold and half dead inside, going through the motions of living without ever truly being alive." He took my hands in his grip almost painful in its intensity. "You woke me up," he said. "You, with your defiance and your courage and your refusal to bow to a world that had given you nothing. You showed me that another way was possible. You showed me that I did not have to be the man my father raised me to be, the man society expected me to be. I could choose. I could be something else, something more." "But the scandal," I whispered. "Your family, your position, everything you have worked for." "Everything I have worked for means nothing without you. My family will survive the scandal, as families always do. My position is secure enough to weather any storm, and if it were not, if choosing you meant losing everything else, I would still choose you. 1,000 times over, I would choose you." I was crying then, tears streaming down my face, and I could not tell if they were tears of joy or sorrow or some complicated mixture of both. All I knew was that this man, this impossible, infuriating, wonderful man, was offering me something I had never dared to imagine. He was offering me a future. "Are you certain?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Are you absolutely certain?" He kissed me then, deeply and thoroughly, and when he pulled back, his eyes were shining with unshed tears of his own. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. The ship was a merchant vessel called the Prosperity, bound for England after a long voyage through the southern seas. Her captain, a weathered man named Reynolds, was astonished to find us on the island, and even more astonished when the Duke of Ashworth identified himself. The news of the shipwreck had reached England months ago, apparently, and we had been presumed dead. There had been memorial services, Adrian told me later. His estate had been preparing to pass to a distant cousin. The voyage home was strange and disorienting. After so many months of solitude, the presence of other people felt overwhelming, their noise and bustle and assault on senses grown accustomed to silence. And there were the looks, the whispers, the barely concealed curiosity about the nature of our relationship. Captain Reynolds was too polite to ask directly, but I saw the questions in his eyes every time he looked at us. Adrian made no attempt to hide what we were to each other. He requested that I be given quarters adjacent to his own, and when the captain hesitated, Adrian fixed him with a look that would have frozen the Thames. "Miss Rosalind is under my protection," he said, in a tone that brooked no argument. "She will be treated with every courtesy due to a lady of quality. Is that understood?" Captain Reynolds understood. And if he and his crew thought it strange that a duke should be so solicitous of a woman who was clearly not of his class, they kept their thoughts to themselves. The journey took 6 weeks, and during that time Adrian and I talked endlessly about what awaited us. He was under no illusions about the challenges we would face. His family would object, strenuously. Society would be scandalized. There would be whispers and snubs and doors that closed in our faces. But he had a plan, he told me, a way to protect me from the worst of it. "I will not ask you to be my mistress," he said one evening as we stood at the railing watching the stars. "That would be an insult to everything you are, everything we have become to each other. I will ask you to be my wife." "Your wife?" I repeated, certain I had misheard. "Adrian, that is impossible. The law." "The law permits a man to marry whomever he chooses," he said firmly. "There is no statute that says a duke may not wed a servant. There will be consequences, certainly. My family will be appalled. Society will whisper. Some doors may close, but others will open, and in time the scandal will fade, as scandals always do. What will remain is us, together, building a life on our own terms." "But your heir," I protested, "your family legacy. If you marry me, any children we might have will be loved," he interrupted. "Will be raised to know that their worth is not determined by the circumstances of their birth. Will be taught that courage and kindness and integrity matter more than bloodlines or bank accounts." He took my face in his hands, his gaze intent. "I do not care about legacy, Rosalind. I care about you. I care about the life we can build together. Everything else is just noise." I wanted to believe him. With every fiber of my being, I wanted to believe that love could triumph over class and convention, that we could carve out a space for ourselves in a world designed to keep us apart. But years of experience had taught me to be cautious, to guard my heart against hope that might prove false. "Let us wait," I said finally. "Let us return to England and see how things unfold. If you still feel the same way in 6 months, in a year, then we can discuss marriage. But I will not let you make a decision in the heat of the moment that you might come to regret." He looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him that I was serious. He nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. 6 months. But I warn you, Rosalind, my feelings will not change. If anything, they will only grow stronger." England, when we finally reached her shores, seemed both familiar and utterly foreign. The gray skies and green fields, the smell of coal smoke and rain, the press of humanity in the streets and harbors, all of it felt strange after the bright solitude of our island. I had been gone less than a year, but I felt as though I had been transformed into an entirely different person, one who no longer fit easily into the world she had left behind. The first night on English soil, we stayed at an inn in Plymouth, a respectable establishment that catered to travelers of quality. Adrian had secured 2 rooms, maintaining a pretense of propriety that felt absurd after everything we had shared. But I understood the necessity. The real world had rules, and we would need to navigate them carefully if we were to have any chance of building a life together. I lay awake that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of civilization, the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the distant shouts of drunken sailors, the creaking of the inn settling into sleep. The bed was soft beneath me, softer than anything I had slept on in months, and yet I could not find comfort. I kept thinking about the island, about the simple rhythm of our days there, about the way the world had narrowed down to just the two of us and what we meant to each other. A knock at my door made me start. "It is me." Adrian's voice came through the wood, low and urgent. I opened the door and he slipped inside, closing it quickly behind him. In the candlelight, his face was troubled. "I could not sleep," he said. "I kept thinking about everything that awaits us, all the battles we will have to fight. And I realized I needed to see you, to remind myself that this is real, that we are real." I took his hand and led him to the window where the moonlight spilled across the floor like silver water. "We are real," I said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, or the day after, or a year from now, this is real. We are real." He gathered me into his arms and held me tightly, and we stood there until the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The journey to London took 3 days by coach, 3 days of jostling roads and uncomfortable seats and increasingly anxious anticipation. Adrian spent much of the time staring out the window, his brow furrowed in thought. I could see him marshalling his forces, preparing for the campaign ahead, and I loved him for it, even as I feared what that campaign might cost him. "Tell me about your family," I said on the second day, partly to distract him, and partly because I genuinely wanted to know what I was walking into. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My mother you will meet soon enough. She is a formidable woman, proud and rigid in her views, shaped by the loss of my father and the demands of raising a duke. She means well in her way, but her idea of what is best and mine have always been at odds. And your father, what was he like? Cold, distant, obsessed with duty and legacy and the preservation of the family name. He died when I was 19, and I mourned him more out of obligation than genuine grief." "Is that terrible to say?" "It is honest," I replied. "That is never terrible. He would have despised you, I think, not because of who you are, but because of what you represent, a disruption of the natural order, a challenge to everything he believed in. He would have seen our love as a kind of disease, something to be cured or cut out before it could spread. And you? Do you see it that way?" He turned to look at me, and his eyes were fierce. "I see it as salvation," he said. "I see it as the only thing that has ever made sense in my entire misbegotten life. London, when we finally arrived, was overwhelming in a way I had not anticipated. I had been to the city before, of course, accompanying previous employers on shopping trips or social occasions, but always as a servant, invisible and ignored. Now I walked through its streets as something else entirely, something undefined and dangerous, and I felt the weight of eyes upon me wherever I went. Adrian's townhouse on Grosvenor Square was magnificent, a 4-story edifice of pale stone with tall windows and a pillared entrance. Servants lined up to greet us as we arrived, their faces carefully neutral, though I caught whispers and sidelong glances as I passed. They knew, of course. Servants always knew. The gossip would have reached them long before we did, carried on the invisible currents that connected great houses throughout the city. The housekeeper, a thin-lipped woman named Mrs. Granger, greeted me with barely concealed contempt. "I have prepared the rose room for the young lady," she said, addressing Adrian as though I were not standing right beside him. "It is in the east wing, well away from the family apartments." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Miss Rosalind will be staying in the gold suite," he said, his voice carrying a warning that even the most oblivious person could not have missed. "Adjacent to my own chambers, And Mrs. Granger, I expect her to be treated with every courtesy due to an honored guest of this household. Is that clear?" Mrs. Granger's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." That first night in London, I dined alone in my sumptuous chambers, surrounded by silk and velvet and more luxury than I had ever experienced in my life. Adrian had been called away to meet with his solicitors, urgent business that could not wait, and I found myself wandering through the rooms like a ghost, touching the expensive fabrics and examining the ornate furniture with a mixture of wonder and disquiet. Who was I in this world of wealth and privilege? Not a servant anymore, but not a lady either. Not Adrian's wife, but not merely his mistress. I existed in a strange twilight space, belonging nowhere, fitting in with no one, my identity as uncertain as my future. There was a mirror in the dressing room, gilt-framed and enormous, and I stood before it for a long time, examining my reflection. The woman who stared back at me was a stranger. Her face was tanned from months of island sun, her hair longer and wilder than any proper English lady would allow. Her eyes, though, were the same eyes that had gazed back at me from every mirror I had ever encountered, guarded and watchful, carrying the weight of a lifetime of careful observation. "Who are you?" I asked the reflection, but she had no answer. Adrian returned late, exhausted but triumphant. "The legal matters are in order," he said, collapsing into a chair beside the fire I had built. "My estate is secure, my finances intact. The cousin who thought he would inherit is, I am told, quite distraught." "I am sorry to hear that." "Do not be. He is a worthless creature, a gambler and a wastrel who would have run through the family fortune in a decade. The estate is better off in my hands, and everyone knows it." He reached out and pulled me down into his lap, burying his face in my hair. "I missed you today," he murmured. Even a few hours apart felt like an eternity. "You will need to get used to it," I said, though my heart ached at the thought. "We cannot be together every moment. The world will not allow it." "Then the world will have to learn to accommodate us. I am done living according to the world's expectations." His words were brave, but I heard the exhaustion beneath them, the strain of holding fast against forces that would have broken a lesser man. I held him close and let him rest, and I prayed silently to whatever gods might be listening, that we would have the strength to endure what was coming. Adrian's return from the dead was a sensation, of course. The newspapers were full of it, breathless accounts of the shipwreck and the miraculous survival of the Duke of Ashworth on a remote island. There were interviews and public appearances, a formal reception at the palace where the king himself expressed his pleasure at Adrian's safe return. Through it all, Adrian maintained a careful silence about the nature of our relationship, though he made no effort to distance himself from me. I was installed in a small but comfortable house on the outskirts of London, far enough from fashionable society to avoid the worst of the scrutiny, but close enough that Adrian could visit frequently. He came every day, sometimes twice a day, and we talked and laughed and made love with an urgency born of our new circumstances. But there was a shadow over our happiness now, the shadow of the world outside our little sanctuary, pressing in on us from all sides. His family was the first test. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth, Adrian's mother, was a formidable woman in her 60s, possessed of the kind of imperious manner that could curdle milk at 20 paces. She had been widowed young and had raised her son alone, shaping him into the image of what she believed a duke should be. The news of his return had brought her to London from the family seat in Yorkshire, and she demanded an audience with her son within days of his arrival. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, her carriage pulling up to the townhouse with a clatter of hooves and a great deal of ceremony. I watched from the window of my chamber as she descended, a tall figure in black silk, her gray hair swept back beneath a severe bonnet. Even from a distance, I could see the resemblance to Adrian, the same strong jaw, the same proud bearing. though in her case, pride had curdled into something harder and less forgiving. Adrian had warned me to stay out of sight during the initial meeting, and I had agreed, though every instinct cried out against hiding like a criminal. But I knew he was right. His mother needed to be handled carefully, approached with strategy rather than confrontation. There would be time enough for her to meet me when the groundwork had been laid. I paced my chamber like a caged animal, straining to hear something, anything, of what was being said in the drawing room below. The minutes stretched into hours. Tea was served and cleared away. More tea was brought. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows through my windows, and still the meeting continued. When Adrian finally came to me, his face was grim. "She knows," he said, pacing the small parlor of my house like a caged lion. "Someone on the ship talked, or perhaps she simply guessed. She knows about us, and she is not pleased." "What did she say?" "What do you imagine she said? That I have been seduced by a scheming servant girl who is out to snare a duke. That you must be sent away immediately before the scandal becomes impossible to contain. That if I persist in this foolishness, I will be dead to her forever." He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "She threatened to cut me off," he continued, "to have me declared incompetent and remove me from control of the estate. She has no legal grounds, of course, but the threat itself speaks to the depth of her opposition." "Can she do that? Have you declared incompetent?" "In theory, with enough money and the right physicians willing to swear that I have lost my reason. In practice, it would be nearly impossible. But the fact that she is even considering it tells me how serious she is." He turned to face me, and I saw the strain in his eyes, the toll that this confrontation had taken on him. "She gave me an ultimatum," he said quietly. "Renounce you by the end of the month, or face the consequences." She did not specify what those consequences would be, but I can imagine. I felt my heart constrict painfully in my chest. "Adrian, perhaps she is right," I said quietly. "Perhaps I should go. I could return to service somewhere, start over, forget." "No." His voice was fierce, allowing no argument. "I will not lose you, Rosalind. Not to my mother, not to society, not to anyone. I told you what I wanted, and my feelings have not changed. If anything, my mother's opposition has only strengthened my resolve. But she is your mother. She is family. You are my family now, or you will be when you consent to be my wife." The weeks that followed were a trial by fire. The Dowager Duchess, true to her word, launched a campaign to destroy our relationship. She wrote letters to everyone of consequence, painting me as a fortune hunter and a seductress who had ensnared her innocent son during his vulnerability on the island. She called upon old friends and allies, rallying them to her cause, creating a united front of disapproval that threatened to overwhelm us. Society matrons who might have been curious about the romantic castaway suddenly closed their doors. Invitations that had been tentatively extended were rescinded. The newspapers, initially charmed by our story, began to print darker insinuations about my character and my motives. I bore it as best I could, retreating further into the shelter of Adrian's protection, avoiding the public spaces where whispers followed me like shadows. But the isolation wore on me. The sense of being trapped in a gilded cage, visible to all and yet invisible, judged by everyone and understood by no one. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into the siege, I was sitting in the garden behind Adrian's townhouse, seeking a moment of peace amid the chaos. The garden was walled and private, one of the few places I could go without fear of prying eyes, and I had taken to spending hours there, reading or simply staring at the sky. I was startled from my reverie by the sound of footsteps on the gravel path. Looking up, I found myself face to face with a young woman about my own age, elegantly dressed in blue silk, her dark hair arranged in fashionable ringlets. She was beautiful in the way that wealthy women often were, polished and perfected by money and leisure, but there was something kind in her eyes that set her apart from the cold society creatures I had encountered thus far. "You must be Miss Rosalind," she said, her voice warm. "I hope I am not intruding. The butler told me I might find you here." "You are not intruding," I said cautiously, rising to my feet. "But I confess I do not know who you are. Forgive me, how rude. I am Lady Sophia Blackwood. My husband, Lord Blackwood, is one of Adrian's oldest friends. I have been meaning to call on you for weeks, but circumstances have been rather difficult." "The circumstances being the campaign to destroy me," I said, more bitterly than I had intended. Lady Sophia had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes, well, the Dowager Duchess is a formidable opponent. Many people are afraid to cross her." "But you are not?" "My husband owes his life to Adrian. They served together in the army before Adrian inherited the title. During a skirmish, Adrian pulled William from beneath a fallen horse at considerable risk to himself. William says he will never forget that debt, and neither will I. The Dowager Duchess's displeasure is a small price to pay for honoring it." She settled onto the bench beside me, arranging her skirts with practiced ease. "I wanted you to know that not everyone believes what they are saying about you," she continued. "William has spoken with Adrian at length, and he is convinced that your attachment is genuine. As am I. The way Adrian speaks of you, the light that comes into his eyes when he says your name, those are not the signs of a man being manipulated. Those are the signs of a man in love." I felt tears prick at my eyes, and I blinked them back fiercely. "Thank you," I managed. "You cannot know how much that means to me." "I think I can," she said gently. "I know what it is to be an outsider, Miss Rosalind. My own family was not wealthy, not noble. I married William against his family's wishes, and though they have come to accept me over the years, it was not an easy road. So I understand, at least in part, what you are facing." She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it firmly. "You are not alone," she said. "And if there is anything I can do to help, anything at all, you have only to ask." Lady Sophia became my first friend in this new world, and through her, I began to find my footing. She introduced me to others who were willing to look past my origins and see me for who I was. Women who had faced their own battles against society's rigid expectations, women who understood that love could not be neatly confined within the boundaries of class and convention. The months that followed were the most difficult of my life, and yet also, in their way, the most rewarding. Adrian was true to his word, refusing to bow to pressure from any quarter. He escorted me openly in public, ignoring the whispers and the pointed stares. He introduced me to those friends who had remained loyal, presenting me not as a former servant, but as the woman he loved. Some were shocked, some were scandalized, but a few, a precious few, accepted me with genuine warmth. And slowly, imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. It started with small things. A countess who had snubbed me at a garden party sent a note of apology, explaining that she had been hasty in her judgment and requesting the pleasure of my company for tea. A newspaper columnist who had written scathingly about the Duke's inappropriate attachment published a retraction, praising instead the romantic nature of a love that transcended class. A popular novelist, inspired by our story, published a thinly veiled fictional account that portrayed the servant girl as a heroine of uncommon virtue and courage. "You see," Adrian said, when I showed him the book, "the world is coming around. Give it time, and they will forget there was ever anything scandalous about us at all." I was not so certain. Society's memory was long, and its cruelty could be refined to a razor's edge. But I allowed myself to hope just a little that he might be right. The 6 months I had requested passed quickly, and when they were gone, Adrian renewed his proposal with a determination that bordered on the comical. "Well," he asked, on the anniversary of the day we had arrived back in England, "I have waited patiently, as you requested. I have endured my mother's tantrums and society's whispers and the endless, tedious business of being a duke. I have done everything you asked, and my feelings have not wavered for a single moment. Will you please, for the love of God, agree to marry me?" I laughed. I could not help it, and then I kissed him soundly on the mouth. "Yes," I said when I finally pulled back. "Yes, I will marry you." The preparations for our wedding were unlike anything I could have imagined. Lady Sophia took charge of the practical arrangements, overcoming my protests with cheerful determination, insisting that a duke's wedding, even a modest one, required a certain level of attention to detail. She dragged me to dressmakers and florists, consulted with me about menus and music, treated the whole affair as though it were the most normal thing in the world for a former servant to marry into one of England's oldest families. "You are going to be a duchess," she said, when I expressed my discomfort at the fuss. "The least we can do is make sure you look the part." "I do not want to look the part. I want to look like myself." She smiled, and there was understanding in her eyes. "Then we shall make sure you look like yourself, only more so. The most beautiful, radiant version of yourself that the world has ever seen." The gown she helped me choose was simple, as I had requested, but exquisite in its simplicity. Ivory silk that seemed to glow with an inner light, cut to flatter my figure without ostentation, with delicate lace at the cuffs and collar that had been made by nuns in a convent in France. When I tried it on for the final fitting, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. "There," Lady Sophia said, her voice soft with satisfaction. "Now, that is a duchess." The wedding was a small affair, by ducal standards. We were married in the chapel at Ashworth Hall, the family seat in Yorkshire, on a morning when the sky was the color of pearls and the air smelled of rain and roses. The congregation was modest, perhaps 50 people in all, but they were people who mattered to us, people who had stood by us through the storm. Adrian's mother was not among them. She had refused to attend, had sworn that she would never acknowledge me as the Duchess of Ashworth, and for once Adrian had not argued with her. Some battles, he said, were not worth fighting. The chapel itself was ancient and beautiful, its stone walls covered in climbing roses, its windows filled with stained glass that cast colored light across the worn floor. As I walked down the aisle toward Adrian, I was struck by the weight of history pressing down on us, all the generations of Ashworths who had been married in this place, who had made vows before this altar, who had built lives and legacies that stretched back centuries. And now here I was, Rosalind the Maid, about to add my name to that long line. The enormity of it threatened to overwhelm me. But then I looked at Adrian, standing at the altar in his finest coat, his eyes shining with love and pride, and everything else fell away. I wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the estate grounds. As I walked down the aisle toward the man who would become my husband, I thought of my mother and her warning about hope. She had been wrong, I decided. Hope was not a luxury. It was a necessity, the thing that kept us moving forward, the light that guided us through the darkness. The vicar, an elderly man who had known Adrian since childhood, conducted the ceremony with quiet dignity. When he asked if anyone knew of any reason why we should not be joined in matrimony, there was a moment of tense silence, as though half the congregation expected the doors to burst open and the Dowager Duchess to come storming in with an army of objectors. But the doors remained closed, and the moment passed, and the vicar continued with a smile that suggested he was well aware of the drama he had navigated. When Adrian slipped the ring onto my finger, when the vicar pronounced us man and wife, when he kissed me in front of everyone and I heard the scattered applause, I felt something shift in the universe, some fundamental reordering of what was possible. I was no longer Rosalind the Maid. I was Rosalind, Duchess of Ashworth. The girl who had eaten the fish and said no had become something else entirely. The wedding breakfast was held in the great hall of Ashworth Hall, beneath portraits of Adrian's ancestors that seemed to gaze down at me with varying degrees of approval and disapproval. Lady Sophia had arranged everything beautifully, tables laden with delicacies, champagne flowing freely, music playing softly in the background. I moved through the gathering in a daze, accepting congratulations from people whose names I barely knew, feeling all the while like an imposter in my own celebration. It was Lord Blackwood, Lady Sophia's husband, who finally put me at ease. He found me standing alone near one of the great windows, staring out at the Yorkshire moors that stretched away to the horizon. "Overwhelming, is it not?" he said, coming to stand beside me. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who has felt the same thing." He smiled, and I saw in his weathered face the kindness that had made his wife speak so highly of him. When I married Sophia, I felt as though I were watching someone else's life unfold. How could this be happening to me, I kept thinking. How could I be so fortunate? "I keep waiting to wake up," I admitted, "to discover that it was all a dream and I am still a servant scrubbing floors somewhere. That feeling will pass, in time. But the gratitude, the wonder at your good fortune, that never entirely goes away. And that is as it should be. The moment we stop being grateful for love is the moment we start to lose it." He raised his glass to me. "To love," he said, "may it always find us worthy." "To love," I echoed, and drank deeply. The wedding night was tender and passionate, and everything I could have hoped for. Adrian took me to the ducal chambers, rooms I had once cleaned as a servant and never dreamed I would occupy as a wife. He undressed me slowly, reverently, as though I were something precious and fragile, and when we came together, it was with a depth of feeling that transcended the physical. "My wife," he whispered in the darkness afterward, "my Rosalind, my Duchess." "Your servant girl who ate your fish," I replied, and we both laughed, and then we were kissing again, and the laughter gave way to something deeper, and the night stretched on into forever. The years that followed were not without their challenges. There were snubs and slights, doors that remained closed, invitations that never came. The Dowager Duchess maintained her bitter silence until her death 5 years after our wedding, never once acknowledging me, never once meeting the grandchildren who might have brought her joy. That was her choice, her loss, and while I grieved for what might have been, I refused to let her bitterness poison the life Adrian and I had built. The first year of our marriage was a time of adjustment and discovery. I had to learn what it meant to be a duchess, to manage a great household, to navigate the complex social waters that threatened to drown me at every turn. There were moments when I felt utterly out of my depth, when the weight of my new responsibilities seemed crushing, when I longed for the simple clarity of my days as a servant, when all I had to worry about was completing my tasks and staying out of sight. But Adrian was always there to steady me, to remind me that I was capable of far more than I knew. He encouraged me to trust my instincts, to approach the challenges of my new position with the same practical intelligence that had helped us survive on the island. And slowly, tentatively, I began to find my footing. The servants were my first concern. I could not forget that I had been one of them, that I understood their lives and their struggles in a way that few mistresses ever could. I made changes to the household routine, instituting regular days off and better wages, improving the quality of the food served in the servants' hall, treating every member of the staff with the dignity and respect I had so often been denied. At first, the servants were suspicious of me. They had heard the whispers about my origins, and many expected me to be either condescending, desperate to distance myself from my past, or overly familiar, unable to maintain the necessary boundaries between mistress and servant. But I was neither. I was simply myself, and gradually, as they came to know me, their suspicion gave way to something warmer. Mrs. Granger, the housekeeper who had greeted me with such contempt on my first day in London, proved to be my most unlikely ally. She had served the Ashworth family for 30 years, and she knew its secrets better than anyone. One evening, about 6 months into my tenure as Duchess, she came to me in my private sitting room, her face troubled. "Your Grace," she began, and I could see how much the title cost her. "I owe you an apology." "An apology, Mrs. Granger? Whatever for?" "For the way I treated you when you first arrived. I believed what they were saying about you, that you were a schemer and a fortune hunter who had taken advantage of His Grace's vulnerability. But I was wrong. I have watched you these past months, and I see now that I misjudged you badly." I gestured for her to sit, something no duchess would normally do with a servant, but I was not a normal duchess. "You judged me as you were trained to judge," I said gently, "as the world judges all women who step outside their appointed place. I do not blame you for it. You are too kind, Your Grace. I am not kind. I am practical. And practically speaking, I need allies in this household if I am to succeed. Will you be my ally, Mrs. Granger?" She looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, a thawing of the ice that had always stood between us. "I will, Your Grace. You have my word." From that day forward, Mrs. Granger became my most trusted advisor in matters of household management, her encyclopedic knowledge of the estate and its workings proving invaluable as I navigated the complexities of my new role. Society was slower to warm to me, but even there, progress was made. Lady Sophia's friendship opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and as people came to know me, many found their initial prejudices difficult to maintain. I was not the scheming seductress they had expected. I was merely a woman who had fallen in love with a man and who had been brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to reach for happiness when it was offered. Because that life was rich beyond anything I could have imagined. We had 2 daughters, twins named Catherine and Margaret, who inherited their father's dark eyes and their mother's stubborn spirit. They came into the world on a stormy autumn night, and when the midwife placed them in my arms, I wept with a joy so profound it felt like pain. I had never imagined I would be a mother, had never dared to dream of children of my own. And yet here they were, 2 perfect miracles, proof that the universe could surprise even the most skeptical heart. Adrian was besotted with them from the first moment. I watched him hold them, one in each arm, his face soft with wonder, and I saw the ghost of the man he might have been, the man whose wife and child had died and left him hollow. The twins gave him back something he had lost, some essential piece of himself that had been missing for so long, and I loved him even more for the way he loved them. We raised them at Ashworth Hall, away from the worst of society's scrutiny, in an atmosphere of love and learning and laughter. I was determined that my daughters would have opportunities I had never had, that they would be educated and empowered and free to choose their own paths. Adrian agreed wholeheartedly, dismissing the conventional wisdom that said girls needed only enough education to attract a husband and manage a household. "Our daughters will be scholars," he declared when we discussed their future. "They will study science and philosophy and literature. They will travel the world and form their own opinions. And when they marry, if they marry, it will be for love, not duty or obligation." "You are a revolutionary, Your Grace," I teased him. "I learned from the best," he replied, and kissed me soundly. I established a school on the estate grounds, fulfilling the dream I had confided to Adrian on that distant island, teaching the children of the tenants and the servants the things I had once taught myself by candlelight. The school started small, just a single room in an outbuilding, with a handful of students and whatever books I could scrounge together. But it grew quickly, as word spread of the Duchess, who taught reading and writing to the children of the poor, and soon we had a proper schoolhouse, with multiple classrooms and a library and teachers whom I trained myself. The local gentry were scandalized, of course. A duchess did not teach lessons to servant children. A duchess did not muddy herself with the concerns of the lower classes. But I had long since stopped caring what the local gentry thought. I was Rosalind, the maid who had eaten the Duke's fish, and said no. I did not ask permission to live my life. The school became my passion and my purpose. I threw myself into it with the same determination I had brought to survival on the island, working long hours, experimenting with new methods of instruction, advocating tirelessly for the value of education for all people, regardless of their station in life. And slowly, through the school, I began to see a different kind of change taking shape, a softening of the rigid boundaries that had defined my world since birth. Parents who had once looked at their children and seen only future servants began to imagine other possibilities. Students who had never held a book in their lives discovered the joy of reading, the power of knowledge, the freedom that came from understanding the world around them. And I, who had once believed that my place was fixed and immutable, watched as the walls I had thought eternal began to crumble, one brick at a time. Adrian supported me every step of the way, using his influence and his resources to protect the school from those who would have shut it down. He spoke in the House of Lords about the importance of education for the working classes, enduring the mockery of his peers with characteristic dignity. He funded scholarships for promising students, sending them to universities and apprenticeships that would have been unthinkable a generation before. "You are changing the world," he told me one evening, as we sat together watching the sun set over the moors. "We are changing the world," I corrected him. "I could never have done any of this without you. You could have done anything you set your mind to, with or without me. I merely had the good fortune to be standing beside you when you did it. And through it all, through triumphs and setbacks, through joys and sorrows, through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life, Adrian and I remained what we had become on that island: partners, lovers, friends, two people who had found each other against all odds and refused to let go. There were difficult times, of course. The death of Lady Sophia, my dearest friend, in a carriage accident that also claimed her husband, left me devastated for months. The outbreak of cholera that swept through the village, sparing Ashworth Hall but claiming the lives of dozens of our tenants and students, tested my faith in the fundamental goodness of the universe. Adrian's recurring illness, a weakness of the lungs that had plagued him since childhood and grew worse with age, filled me with a terror I could barely acknowledge, the prospect of losing him too vast and awful to contemplate. But we weathered these storms together, as we had weathered the literal storm that had brought us to our island. We held each other through the grief and the fear, drawing strength from our connection, reminding ourselves that whatever came, we were not alone. Love, we discovered, was not a shield against suffering, but it was a balm, a comfort, a reason to keep going even when the darkness seemed absolute. I'm an old woman now, my hair silver, my face lined with the marks of time. Adrian passed 3 winters ago, slipping away peacefully in his sleep with my hand in his. The grief was terrible, a black tide that threatened to drown me, but I survived it, as I have survived everything else. I am stronger than I look, stronger than anyone ever expected a servant girl to be. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I think about the woman I was before the shipwreck. I think about the maid who moved through grand houses like a ghost, invisible and silent, expecting nothing from life but labor and loneliness. I think about what might have happened if the storm had not come, if the ship had completed its voyage, if I had returned to England, still a servant, and continued serving until my body gave out like my mother's had before me. But that is not how the story went. The story went like this: a ship sank, and a woman washed up on shore, and a duke ordered her to cook his fish, and she ate it and said no. And in that simple act of defiance, in that small, brave refusal to accept the place the world had assigned her, everything changed. The duke fell in love with the maid, and the maid fell in love with the duke, and together they built something new, something that had never existed before, something that proved, once and for all, that the world's order was not the only order possible. My granddaughters come to visit me often, bright-eyed young women with their whole lives ahead of them. They ask me to tell them stories, and I tell them this one, the story of how their grandmother ate a fish and changed the world. They laugh, as young people do, but I see something else in their eyes, something that looks like recognition, like understanding, like hope. The world is changing, slowly but surely. The rigid hierarchies that defined my youth are crumbling, one brick at a time. Young women today have opportunities their grandmothers could never have dreamed of, and while there is still much work to be done, the progress is undeniable. I like to think that Adrian and I played some small part in that progress, that our love was a pebble dropped into a pond, sending ripples outward that will continue long after we are gone. But perhaps that is vanity. Perhaps our story was just our story, significant to us alone. One small flame in the vast darkness of history. It does not matter, really. What matters is that we lived it, fully and completely, holding nothing back. What matters is that we loved each other, not because the world approved, but because we could not do otherwise. What matters is that we were brave enough to say no to the lives we had been given and yes to the lives we chose. I am tired now. The sun is setting over Ashworth Hall, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and I think I will close my eyes for a while. Perhaps I will dream of Adrian, young and strong and laughing on our island beach. Perhaps I will dream of the sea that tried to kill us and instead set us free. Perhaps I will dream of nothing at all, slipping into the darkness that awaits us all. But before I go, I want to say this, to whoever might be reading, to my granddaughters and their daughters and all the daughters yet to come, do not be afraid to say no. Do not be afraid to defy the order of things, to claim your own worth, to demand what you deserve. The world will try to convince you that your place is fixed, that your fate is sealed, that hope is a luxury you cannot afford. But the world is wrong. I know, because I was a maid who ate the Duke's fish and said no. And look what happened.